Hello, everybody. This is Liam Billingham, co-host of Oeuvre Busters. Before we jump into this week's episode of Capote, directed by Bennett Miller and starring in an Oscar-winning performance, Philip Seymour Hoffman as Truman Capote, I wanted to take a minute and remind you to please rate, review, and subscribe to Oeuvre Busters if you haven't done already. We are up to on the Apple Music, Apple iTunes, whatever you want to call it, system. We have 21 reviews, 20 of which are 5 stars, and one of which is 4 stars. And hey, we'll take any review above 3 stars. No 3 stars, 4 and above. Thank you. We also have a new review, a nice written review. Reviews are written, and this one is too. It was written about a week ago by C.F. Heiler, and they gave us 5 stars, and they said, great, capital Great pod. I'm completely addicted to this show. I've seen maybe 10% of the movies they talk about on the podcast, but it doesn't matter. I could listen to these nerds read the phone book. What a recommendation. I could listen to these nerds read the phone book. Thank you, C.F. Heiler. It's good to hear from you. It's good to hear this review, and makes us feel good. And it's important to make your podcast hosts feel good. So thank you very much. Please tell your friends to listen to the show. Our next episode after this episode on Capote is going to be Mission Impossible 3, and we all crave more MI content. So please tell the world. All right, that's it. I hope you enjoy this episode on Capote. I'm Liam Billingham.
I'm George Frigopoulos.
And this is
Oeuvre
Buster.
Sing it again.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's the good stuff.
That's
this episode
life-sustaining water.
This episode brought to you by
H2O.
No, it's H2O.
You can't spell Uber without O.
And H2O.
What are we talking about today, Liam?
This week we're talking about Capote,
from
directed
2005.
by Bennett Miller, from 2005.
Yes, the year of our Lord, 2005.
A
great year.
Great year for movies. A fucking great year for movies. One of my favorite movies of all time came out that year.
The Clone Wars?
Good Night and Good Luck.
Oh, I've never seen it.
Get the fuck out of here. You haven't seen that movie?
No, I've not.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
2005, this film won Best Actor. It was nominated for Best Director.
Yes.
And it was also nominated for Best Picture and Best Adapted Screenplay. George, what's the movie about?
So the movie is about Truman Capote.
Played by
Philip Seymour Hoffman. And his writing of what will eventually become In Cold Blood.
In the 60s.
In the 60s,
oh,
yeah.
Sorry,
late 50s.
It begins in 59, that's right. The murders happened in November of 1959.
And it's just basically about his
life.
His experience writing this book.
Right, and then the things that happened to him in his life. And very quickly, he goes to Kansas, where the murders take place, with Nell Harper.
Who is Harper Lee.
Played
by Catherine
Keener, who I think was also nominated for an Oscar for this film.
She should have been. She's amazing, yeah.
And sort of his obsession with Perry, one of the murderers. And how this sort of affects his life and his relationship with Jack Dunphy, his partner of many years. And the film sort of contrasts being in Kansas and being in Brooklyn in New York, and how what happens in the situation, and sort of what I would say would be his sort of, and at least in the film's case, moral and ethical dilemmas as it relates to how he relates to the subject of his book, while also maintaining a personal life and the descent that leads into his eventual death.
Madness.
His eventual death from alcoholism.
It becomes very Lovecraftian towards the end, which is kind of weird. So have you read the book?
I have not read In Cold Blood. Have you read In Cold Blood?
I have, yeah.
Don't throw your credentials at me.
It is amazing.
Is it an amazing book?
Yeah, it really is.
What did you think of the film?
I loved it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to think of, this might be my favorite that we've done, my favorite Philip Seymour Hoffman film that we've done so far.
Oh, really? More so than the talented Senor Ripley?
Oh, maybe. Well, there were a lot of echoes of talented Mr. Ripley. But yeah, I was maybe that one might be my favorite. But this one's up there.
So let's talk a little bit about. I loved it. I thought it was amazing, and I think that one of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit with this movie is, well, there's a lot to talk about, but let's talk about what I think is. I think the movie does movies about writers are usually not great, and they spend a lot of time showing people like writing and that's an impossible thing to make work cinematically. I forgot the word cinematic. And so in this case, I was impressed by how the film managed to kind of to work with the idea of being a writer, but not necessarily through writing, except for one absolutely amazing scene that I don't want to talk about yet. But I was really blown away by the directing of the film, and I thought it was just like I thought it was beautiful.
Yeah, no, it's a great film. I really liked how controlled it was. I really loved...
It's super controlled.
Super controlled. I really loved what it does in kind of representing or how it represents Capote's sexuality, which I'm sure we'll talk about. I fucking loved every time Philip Seymour Hoffman and Catherine Keener were on screen together, like the dynamic that they have, and especially also kind of like how by the end of the film it becomes this very strained relationship.
Right, but it does it in very, very subtle ways.
Yeah, and it kind of reminded me, speaking of like other like like literati and whatnot, it reminded me of so by the end of the film, the relationship is a little strained because in part Harper Lee is now famous because of To Kill a Mockingbird.
Right.
And it reminded me of this like famous Gore Vidal quote regarding kind of how painful it is to see your friends become more successful than you.
Oh yeah, he said something about when Capote died, Gore Vidal had a quote that was like, "Oh, his that's surely going to be great for his career."
Yeah, and it's also interesting to think like how the film also ends with the post-credit sequences, or not the post-credit. Where the
scene at the end of the movie that it sort of predated the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We had a scene with Tennessee Williams being like, "I've got to figure out this menagerie."
But where there's that where you get the what the fuck is that called? So like after the film, where you get the
you mean like the titles, like the closing titles?
Yeah, the closing titles that tell us that, which I didn't realize.
He never wrote another book after that.
I never completed one.
Let's jump back to the beginning. So the film opens. We don't necessarily need to go scene by scene, but I think to speak to the way the film is directed and its style, the film opens with a young woman going into a home in Kentucky.
Is it Kentucky? Isn't it Arkansas?
Or does the film open?
Kansas?
The film,
Kansas,
it's Kansas.
Yeah, the murder takes place in Kansas.
The murder takes place in Kansas. It opens with this, correct?
It does. With her
so
discovering.
It opens with her coming to a home and discovering two bodies before cutting to sort of a shot of sort of the fields of Kansas, and then like a really nice graphic match cut to Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And I can't overstate how fucking from the first frame of his performance, you're like, I can't believe this is Philip Seymour Hoffman.
The transformation's incredible.
So he has this voice. I can't do it. It's offensive to try to do it.
He does a great job.
He does this great. So first of all, he looks. We've talked about his physicality, but he looks slimmer in this film than he's looked in a lot of other films.
Yeah, and Capote was, especially early on, like a very slim man.
And he's dressed like so they're at like a party, like I believe in the Village, probably, or something like that. But you see it from Brooklyn. It's worth noting he lived in Brooklyn Heights, which is my old neighborhood. So I kept being like, "That's my street. That's my street. That was my street." But he's at a party.
In Brooklyn.
And there was that.
You always have to remind us about Brooklyn.
Hey, we live in Brooklyn. But there are 2 to 3 scenes in the movie where he's at parties and he's kind of holding court.
Yeah, no, totally.
And those scenes are some of the best
in
the movie.
And
in
the
my
first scene
opinion.
he's talking about like
So
having lunch with James. That's James Baldwin. And about he's talking to him about this like novel he's writing.
Right.
And about how it's like supposed to be like really controversial.
Yes.
And again, he's like this kind of witty, intellectual.
Funny.
Yeah. And again, like you said, kind of like holds court. And right from the beginning, the opening scene that we see him in, that's exactly kind of the Capote we're given. Although also later on, you find out that he's very insecure. There's a lot of insecure emotional vulnerability there.
So and there's actually a scene later in the movie that I want to jump to and then come back. Because one of the things that the film, I don't like biopics in a traditional sense. Like what I should say when I say that is I don't like films that try to tackle a subject's entire life. I generally don't think they work. And what I think that works about this film is that it's about a lot more than a performance. It's like a meticulously crafted, probably the best movie of Bennett Miller's. I really love Moneyball. I know you're not a huge fan.
I'm not a huge fan.
I really dislike Foxcatcher.
Yeah. Never saw it.
But and I could get into why, but I feel like this film is like the most sort of, and he did the Cruise film, which is really good too. He did
cruise
Mission
film?
Impossible Fallout.
Like,
no, he directed a
like
movie
Speed
called
2
The
Cruise
Cruise, which
Control?
which is a really good documentary.
Oh.
But
Not Speed 2 Cruise Control.
no, he did that as
did that
well.
as well.
But that was different. That was
that
before
also
he
Jan de
married
Bont?
an Olsen twin.
Did he marry an Olsen twin?
Yeah, he married an Olsen twin.
Wow.
It's a little weird.
Yeah.
There's a big age gap there. But whatever. Anyway, there's
And when he said I do, did she say you got it,
dude?
dude? That's how she gave her.
She's you got it, meaning my
Which is weird.
my hand in
she's
marriage.
She's like 25.
So what happened is she was offering her hand, and she said she was saying, "You got it, dude," and it was in reference to her hand in marriage.
Yeah,
as we all know. There's a scene later in the film where he's read what is the beginnings of In Cold Blood. And there's a party after, and he's like talking to a woman, and this it's such a sad scene.
Yeah. This
older man comes in and talks about how ferocious he makes the killers to be, and the man's sort of uncomfortable, and this Philip Seymour Hoffman is like, oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And the guy walks out, and he makes a joke about the guy, and he's like, bye, Dad. Yeah. And it's like, it's so funny. It's so goddamn funny because it's like, yeah, that's who that guy is, but it's so cruel because this film has a really interesting relationship to the main character in that the film never judges Capote, but it also doesn't side with him at any point in terms of how we're meant to feel about him as a person, which I think is very, very exciting.
So I believe in that first scene, one of the things that he says to one of the people in that party is he says, like, I never lie. It's like, I always tell the truth. And that's really interesting because it comes back later when he's talking to Perry in the cell, and he keeps asking him, it's like, so what are you going to call it? And obviously it's called In Cold Blood.
And he's already said it's called...
And he doesn't tell Perry that it's called In Cold Blood. He lies and keeps deferring. He's like, oh, I actually don't have a title. And it reminded me of that earlier scene about like this question of like, well, to what degree is he being honest?
Right.
And he's not. Obviously, he's fucking lying to Perry like right to his face. But it also raises, again, these interesting kind of like ethical questions regarding like his relationship to these men.
Yes.
And like the degree to which he will go to exploit them.
Yeah.
And use them to create what is a stunning work of literary nonfiction,
and one of like the first sort of like. So I remember I've taught documentary film, and the same year that In Cold Blood came out, Salesman, the Maisels film came out, and so there was this interesting moment in American history where suddenly like popular forms, meaning the novel and the film, were suddenly and documentary film, which up until now had been little more like maybe propaganda films or informational films, suddenly took on this very modern, idiosyncratic, cinematic or novelistic style, but dealing with nonfiction subjects. And so that book is really important to like the evolution of. I don't think In Cold Blood kind of invented a genre.
Yeah, and that's what the film certainly kind of suggests as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know enough about that particular genre to speak to whether or not, in fact, it did inaugurate like the genre entirely.
That seems to be implied a lot of times when you read or hear about the book.
But it's definitely one of the first, if not the first, kind of book of its kind.
Right.
It's kind of like, again, like literary nonfiction, almost like novelistic nonfiction.
So soon they're off to Kentucky.
Kansas?
Soon they're off to Kansas, and he calls his editor. So by the way, we should say that Philip Seymour Hoffman or Capote.
Can we just confirm that it's in Kansas? Because maybe I'm being the idiot.
I swear it's Kentucky, but I could be wrong.
Holcomb, Kansas.
Holcomb, Kansas. Yes. Okay, I don't know why I kept saying Kentucky, except that I am an East Coast elite monster.
Stop. Can you fucking stop sipping that latte? You're always sipping.
I love a latte. I love a latte and a communist novel. So they go. Are they communist? Yeah, they're communist.
Of course,
it's
communist novels. Yes.
I don't know anything about being an East Coast elite. I just am one.
Some of my favorite novels are communist novels.
Give me an example.
So we cut to
Kansas.
You in there that you were talking about the train ride? You want to say something about?
No, they take the train, but I think it is worth noting that the movie does a really strong job of contrasting sort of like East Coast New York City living with Middle America living.
It does well, yes,
and it's very precise.
But it's also done in a way where I'm glad like they're not represented as being like stupid backward hicks.
No, not at all. The film is actually great about that. And that's partially embodied by the fact that you have Amy Ryan and Chris Cooper. Chris Cooper plays the detective investigating the murder, which we later is revealed to be that it's his friend.
Right.
And Amy Ryan plays his wife, and she sort of invites them over, meaning
Capote.
Capote and Harper Lee.
And she kind of like says like that she knows who he is. So the other thing also, like obviously this comes the film. Capote starts writing in cold blood after already writing Breakfast at Tiffany's, which kind of really launches him.
Yeah, there's
my understanding into the spotlight.
And he sort of knows movie stars and is like fairly famous.
Yeah, and there's also, which I didn't realize, there's also all this talk about him working on screenplays, right? Because apparently,
he wrote the Breakfast at Tiffany's screenplay, I think, or was involved with it heavily.
So he's talking about also occasionally drops like names of people like Marilyn Monroe and Humphrey Bogart, and so clearly he is like this well-connected like celebrity,
right?
And he plays off that oftentimes, especially kind of like in his dealings with others.
Yeah.
But is there anything particular you want to say about that scene?
Well,
about
what
him
I like,
one
of the things that's really interesting about this movie is it does make his lifestyle, which is like Brooklyn Heights apartment, books, but also smoking and drinking, really attractive in the early moments of the film.
Totally.
Like they go to dinner at their house and they're drinking martinis and like they're getting like sloshed, but he's so elegant and it's like, you were talking early on in the show about Philip Seymour Hoffman's physicality, and like his physicality in this movie, the way he uses his body is so fucking amazing and so like drastically different than anything else we will see him do kind of across the board. There's like the mannerisms and the sort of the choices he makes. There's a scene where he like comes down in the hotel and he sort of like twirls his coat and
I tweeted that.
how he looks. Yeah, you tweeted it out. It's so elegant and so beautiful, and he comes off he's so weird. I mean, Truman Capote was kind of weird, and the character's weird, and he's very like, I mean, it's one thing the film never says is like, he's gay.
Yes.
We know he's gay.
Yeah.
It's like inherent to the fact that he has a relationship with Bruce Greenwood, who's one of the most underrated actors of all time. But I guess I was just like I was sort of blown away by how romanticized I felt the beginning of his life is in this film. It's so perfectly modulated. Done.
It isn't. It's not because there are also like don't get me wrong. You're watching him hang out with all these like famous people.
Totally.
You're watching him. Well, I mean, like for example, like at some point. What's his partner's name? Is it Jack?
Jack Dunphy, who is an interesting guy, a dancer that became a novelist.
But I unfortunately didn't know anything about him. But at some point he says something like, Capote's out in Kansas and he's working on this book. He's talking to people,
right?
And at some point Jack says something like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to be in Spain. You should come to Spain with me." And it's like, "Oh yeah, we'll go to Spain in the fall." But just the idea that they could drop their lives entirely because obviously they're writers,
they're writers,
they could just go wherever.
I mean,
fuck you. Like,
I know, God,
I want to go to Spain in the fall.
It's really romantic. It's really like beautiful and makes you want to live this life, but he's stuck in Kansas.
Well, also, but he wants to be in Kansas.
Yeah,
and
he wants to be because... Go ahead.
No, I wanted to say, just going back to what you said about like how romanticized it, but there are also these kind of intimations very early on about like his drinking and about his alcoholism.
He might drink too much.
And it becomes a thing, obviously, like later on in the film, especially in that final scene, I think, between him and Harper Lee, there is clearly like this indication that he's like... Not only
descent into alcoholism is happened,
and he's also really kind of jealous of her success, which is clear, I think, at that point because his book still hasn't come out.
He's been working on it for 5 years, I think,
something like that. He's at her film premiere,
which is now like that movie huge. That movie's huge. It's still huge.
Yeah, I never saw. I think I saw it.
It's great. I mean, I haven't seen it
since maybe
high school. What?
Do you know who directed it?
No.
Uh-huh.
We could look it up.
But if only there was a way to do that.
But the film, so as we go through the film, we do see that he gains this relationship with Perry, who's one of the murderers. There's also Ricardo, who's the other murderer, who's kind of a dum-dum. Though, to the movie's credit, makes him smarter than that maybe another film would. But he really becomes obsessed with Perry, who's played by Clifton Collins Jr.
And he does a fucking amazing job.
Who's incredible in this movie. And I kind of feel like I forgot that guy existed. And then remembered, he's on Westworld, right?
He's awesome in Westworld, too.
But I feel like his career hasn't gotten the kind of traction it deserves because he's so good on... He's so good in this movie. I mean, he's really, really great at playing this really one-of-a-kind, charismatic murderer. Mm-hmm. It's just a very, very good performance, and you understand why Capote is so into him.
Yeah, Robert Mulligan, by the way, is the director.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
if there's one issue,
I have cousins named Mulligan.
There you go. I have cousins named Mulligan, the Liam Billingham story.
I don't think George Fragopoulos has cousins named Mulligan.
That's my best joke. And like every time I check in somewhere, like last name Fragopoulos, first name George. I should be the only Fragopoulos probably
in the entire. I'm not sure in Athens. Is Fragopoulos a common Greek name?
No,
I've never heard it before.
So the other thing that's kind of what I was gonna say something like Perry's character. Oh, the only I think the only, and this is perhaps like very like nitpicking, but the only thing that I felt like maybe was lacking in this movie, because it does replicate In Cold Blood so well, is how sympathetic it makes like the murderers.
Tell me more about that. What do you mean it mirrors?
I mean, obviously, like
I should read the book.
What this does,
you should.
Pretty good. It's pretty fucking amazing. What this does, obviously, that's more interesting, or what the book obviously does not do, is that it paints Capote in a bad light.
The film does. The
book
because
what I remember in the book is that there's no sense in, like, he doesn't put himself in the story.
Okay.
And obviously that's what this film does that I think is really kind of interesting. One of the most interesting things that it does. But I also felt like the sympathetic portrayal of the murderers was very reminiscent of also what's happening in the book.
And you think that's a negative?
Why
do you think so? Because they're murderers?
No, not just
because they're murderers.
Not just because they're murderers,
murder.
But just because it replicates what's already in Cold Blood, and maybe that's a weak criticism, but that's why I felt it was like, I've seen this in the book,
right? But it's not a companion piece to the book In Cold Blood. It's just
Correct.
a movie that deals with the
it's
writing.
It's a companion piece to the book that's based on the writing of In Cold Blood.
Right,
I
really
understand. Fucking meta.
Whoa,
mind blown.
That's almost like
what happens if
it's
we're just
almost
like
all
recapping
in a show that doesn't exist.
Yeah, like who the fuck would want to?
Who would do that?
Who would do that? And B, who would do that? And A1, who would listen to that?
I wouldn't.
So, but going back coming soon. But going back to Perry,
right?
He is great. The relationship that they have is great, and what's very fascinating, and too, I think later on, when they are in Spain, I think Catherine Keener says something either directly to him or to Jack. I think she says it to Capote, right? Like, oh, Jack is afraid that you've fallen in love with Perry.
And he kind of... Do you think he falls in love with Perry?
No, I don't. Not in a
conventional sense.
Yeah, I think he falls in love with him in a way that one might fall in love with a friend.
Like tell me, like you and me,
like
you towards me,
exactly,
like you towards me,
but not you towards me.
No, I don't.
Because
feel
clearly
that.
you.
I don't feel that way for you.
This is why you don't write back to any of my letters or respond to my texts. This is this is a professional relationship.
Well, I mean, to be fair, my wife is like, "Why are you constantly texting George?" So hang on, I need to grab my phone because I took some notes. But keep talking,
please. Yeah. And she's like, why? That one time he woke us up at 3 a.m. He was like, psst, Liam, are you awake? I just thought about something about Red Dragon.
Liam, wake up.
Don't you, like,
hey, it's me, George.
The thing about Red Dragon that's kind of cool is this.
George, shut the fuck up. Shut up. I'm sleeping.
The thing about Red Dragon.
I'm sleeping here.
Is that it takes place in the same cinematic universe as Silence of the Lambs. I figured it out. No, yeah, no, I think he falls in love with him as one would fall in love with like a friend.
A good friend.
Like, it's like
a good bud.
Yeah, it's like a friendship. I don't think it's like a romantic
beautiful
kind of
friendship.
Yeah, and I think thankfully I think the film doesn't do that. Like, it doesn't make it so obvious, so heavy-handed. Like, oh my god, he is like just falling in love with him.
So let's talk a little bit with that in mind. One thing I do feel like, and we've talked about this a little bit, but like Capote's motivations are never totally clear. I mean, we understand like he's
I think don't you think they are totally
they're clear in that he's trying to write a book, but the conflict that exists in him is so strongly created within the context of the film that I think it's a good opportunity to talk about Phil Hoffman's performance in this, but not only Phil Hoffman's performance, but like Phil as a guy, because I think the film is, I don't mean this in a cliche sense, but there's a collection of tics. There is the voice, which is so specific. There's the way of moving. There's the style. There's the kind of things he does with his hands that are like, hard to describe, but like very specific. The way he gestures at people. There's a way he looks at people in this movie.
Yeah.
Early on in the film, Chris Cooper is talking about his friend, and Capote is looking at him, and there's this kind of like, how would you say, intent in his look that is so like meaningful, and he's thinking about it. And I sometimes was wondering, is this guy playing at empathy? Is he pretending to be empathetic? Does he have empathy? I had a lot of trouble with how much he actually cares about anyone around him.
Well, I think
does he care about? Yeah,
the film is. I think the film obviously takes us to a point where, like, clearly he does. And so, yeah. So going back to what you said, like, his motivations. Maybe I was a little bit too dismissive. Clearly, there is a tension. So he needs to write this book.
You were too dismissive, and I sent you a text about it.
Yeah, which was weird in the middle of us podcasting too. Yeah.
Well, I was just like very quickly like,
so I gotta get it out. That tweet was really mean. But yes, no. So there's the tension between him needing to write this book and the degree to which he will exploit these men.
Right.
Liam is picking up his phone right now, and the degree to which he honestly and sincerely cares about them. Yeah. So at the end, when he goes, which we need to talk about, right? So he goes, he's basically told they're going to be executed. They have all these appeals. There's also this one moment that's really interesting where, or it happens a couple of times, right? Where, now I'm going to pick up my phone. I'm going to look and see what Liam texted me. Where, but I will continue talking because I can multitask.
I would just check Twitter.
Where they, I'm not going to like that tweet. Where he said, where he keeps getting disappointed that they keep having appeals.
Yes.
Because at some point he's like, I just gotta fucking finish this book.
And unless it's so interesting.
And unless they die, I can't finish the book.
Yeah, unless they die.
So he needs like the ending to the story. But at the very end, it's gonna happen. They're gonna be executed. Yes. He receives a telegram and he goes to visit them one last time.
And then he's catatonic with his publisher, played by Bob Balaban.
Amazing.
Great actor.
Yeah. Great job by Balabaning in this.
He really Balabans the fuck out of this. It was funny that Roger Ebert, may he rest, quote was Bob Balabans the fuck out of this Balaban film.
Right.
Balaban.
Almost as fun to say as Jan de Bont.
No, Balaban's better.
Balaban's better.
Yeah, Balaban's better. The Bob Balaban story.
Somebody needs to make that film.
Yeah, starring.
I'm signing up.
Starring
right.
Bob Balaban?
No, of course not.
Who would play a young Bob Balaban? Finn Wolfhard, the kid from Stranger Things.
Oh, that's a really young Bob Balaban.
Young Bob Balaban.
Yeah.
I'm Baby Balaban.
Baby Balaban.
That's a Baby Balaban.
We need 5 seasons of the Bob Balaban story on Netflix. Yeah. I'm guessing 10 episodes each season.
He was on Mark Maron.
And?
It was a good interview. He's an interesting guy. And Martin Mull, also a good name to say. Martin Mull.
What's the M's and the L's
and the B's? It turns out.
So he goes to visit him when he's about to get executed, and he's in this catatonic state, and eventually he like brings himself to go visit them in prison.
Yes.
And there's this kind of like beautiful scene where he has like a last like words with them.
They're sort of sitting in a room with a bunch of cops.
Yeah.
Fucking.
And he
cops.
Yeah.
No, that's all right.
Yeah. And you're not totally wrong. And then he like breaks down and he starts crying.
Yes. And the warden comes in and is like, you got to go.
You got to go, yeah. Like, you've had your time.
And he's crying. And he feels for them. But so my question is, you mentioned that the film paints Capote in kind of a negative light.
Yeah.
To some extent,
yeah.
Do you feel like this moment at the end is truthful? I feel like it's truthful, but I also feel like, why is he crying? Because does he...
I don't think it's a performance.
No, then they're not pawns. It's certainly not a performance. It's too good for that. But it's also it speaks back to the control. It's such a crafted and controlled performance. But I don't mean that like, oh, I'm spending all the time thinking about how good. He really disappears into the performance he gives in this movie.
Totally.
To the point where you feel like you just sort of forget that you're watching this actor play this part. And it's so different than anything we've seen him play. The biggest film we've seen up to this point is Love Lisa, in terms of everything else has been smaller roles. And we've missed some bigger movies like Owning Mahoney and stuff because you picked Red Dragon and The Master.
Seems like you're holding that against me.
And Almost Famous. You didn't pick Almost Famous. Actually, I could have picked
that.
He's
barely in Almost Famous.
Is he barely in Almost Famous? I haven't seen it in a very long time.
He's only in it for like 10
Does anyone remember Laughter?
He plays Lester Bangs.
Mark Maron's in Almost Famous, so we could have talked about Mark Maron.
If anybody needs their podcast to be promoted, it's definitely Mark Maron.
Yeah, we really need to talk more about Mark Maron.
He needs more downloads. And Liam's literally wearing a Mark Maron t-shirt.
I got it at the tour. But yeah, he really needs the downloads. That guy's hurting.
Yeah.
So
the performance.
It's just... unlike, so here's an interesting thing. I think he's often associated with like playing these sort of schlubs and these kind of like, careful with your mic condom.
Jeez.
He spends a lot of time playing these schlubs and these kind of guys who are like, whatever. And what's beautiful about this is that it has all the intensity of a regular Philip Seymour Hoffman, but because Philip Seymour Hoffman performance, but because he's playing this guy, there's that was historically a person, and he has to adhere to that. The restraint that comes through in the performance is really adds like a tension unlike anything we've seen in other things he's done, and it's complemented well with the directing, which is very austere.
Yes, yeah. I said this to you before we started recording, but this felt like, in a good way, like a very classically well made Hollywood film.
So interesting. I would tell me more about why you think that.
Just because
why do you think that?
Why
would you think that?
What the fuck is wrong with you?
Ugh.
Tell me. Just in the sense that I don't feel it does any, and I don't mean this in any sort of, I just mean that there's a certain kind of like craftsmanship,
right,
and a certain kind of skill that is clearly felt like it's a very good product, and I don't mean that in a bad way. But
it sounds bad though, bud. It sounds real bad.
Doesn't matter. I'm fucking owning it. But
okay,
it's well crafted.
Right, it's beautifully crafted and beautifully acted.
But I mean, I enjoyed the fuck out of this film. And I don't want to seem like I didn't, but I didn't walk away from this film thinking like, this is life-changing cinema. That's what I mean. In the sense, like, it's very...
what is life-changing cinema?
Conventional.
What's like a... Oh, see, I don't... I mean, it's conventional in that it tells a narrative from beginning to end, but like, there's an austerity and a...
I love those shots of like the Kansas like plains.
Yeah, and those are. I would never call this classic. Like, I feel like the editing style and the control and the modulation and the make it to me not. I would not say unconventional, but definitely not Hollywood.
Yeah.
So there's a scene later in the film where he comes home from being in Kansas,
right, and
Jack is not there, and so there's this very quiet, as this film is really powerful with suggestion in terms of people. There's a quiet suggestion that they're estranged in the sense that like Jack is not there, like ready to see him. He comes home alone into the house,
right,
and he goes into the bedroom and he puts his really beautiful bag down. And I say that because I was like, ooh, I want to get that bag. And he goes into his what is his writing room, and you see him pull out pages and put them on the table and lift up, and he knows exactly where they have to go. And you see a writer organizing their writing space, which says more about writing and the obsession with writing and what I think like a writer, and I mean that with a capital W, like Truman Capote was a fucking writer. And the film spends, it's probably a 2-minute scene watching him actually recreate and set up his home. And I was like, holy shit, I can't believe the movie is spending time on this. And I mean that in the most complimentary way. That's never going to happen in a conventional movie about Hollywood writing.
Right. But when you think about, I don't know, like...
this is going to be noisy for a second? Hold on.
The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or... or like Sallow. Or like Weekend at Bernie's.
Right.
So like the real like avant-garde cinema.
Oh my God.
Right?
What the fuck are you talking about?
I don't know. I just wanted to put those three films together.
But I think that like that's one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie.
It's not like you're not watching a movie. Again, maybe I'm just not being fair. You're not watching like him. The movie isn't like an hour and a half of him just sitting in a room writing a book.
That's true. Which wouldn't be good.
Yeah.
But the movie also goes a lot further than a lot of movies would do around this subject. In other words,
what's the subject? You mean of him writing the book?
No, his obsession with Perry. A more conventional movie would build to his obsession. This movie establishes his obsession with Perry in a single, maybe 2 scenes. Watching him walk into the courthouse at the beginning and just being like all about this guy, and then later seeing him coming to the woman's home with the jail, and who's in the jail cell, like where coming to the woman's home where there's the jail cell,
the office,
and
with the aspirin.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's it. And then the movie spends the rest of the time with the push and pull of finishing the novel and being a human being.
But don't you think the whole thing about him lying to him also in the cell is like a part of that? Like obsession, like it builds to that, so like he doesn't want to tell him what the book is called because he doesn't want to like hurt his feelings.
Yeah, but I think that another film, a lesser film, would spend all the time like watching us have to understand the intricacies of like why he's obsessed with him and da 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 da, and the movie just gets past that stuff really quickly, and then we spend the rest of the time watching that relationship develop. So finally, when Perry has the scene where he talks about the actual murder, it's so compelling and moving and sad because we've entered into a relationship with Perry through Capote.
Right.
And Capote's in love with this guy. And, you know, the whole idea of him wanting to know what happened that night is a narrative device that is useful because we finally get to see Perry for kind of in some ways the monster that he.
Right, because you see,
he's
find
the
out he's the
murderer.
one that actually like pulled the trigger.
Right.
Even though his narrative is that he initially wanted to let them go, and his partner was like, "No, like we need to get rid of them."
Right.
And then, but Perry's the one that shot them all.
Yeah, totally. So I just think it's a movie that goes a lot further with those. And I think I don't know. I think maybe it's just a really good movie, which is
It
what
is
you
a really
were saying.
good movie, yeah.
But I think it's not conventional in many ways, or not like just a. I know what you mean when you say product, and I know you're not saying it in a negative way, but I think that like it's a little riskier than I feel like we're giving it credit for.
Yeah, I think I will say this. I think what it does for me, also what it does really well, is like the way it deals with his or represents his sexuality.
Yes, tell me more about that.
So I love the fact, for example, that his relationship with Jack is not commented on. That like obviously everybody just like knows what
They're
it
just
is,
dudes.
or at least their friends know what it is. That they know that they're like in this committed relationship with one another. What I also like is that there's no at some points there is like this interesting kind of like tension between, let's say, like the more like, especially in the beginning, like between like the more masculine, let's say, cops and him, especially when he's like wearing the scarf and he's like, oh,
Yes.
it's Bergsdorf or something.
The guy says Sears Roebuck about his hat. It's
yeah.
great. It's a great moment.
And
because
that-
he's a fucking snob
Yeah.
at the beginning of this movie.
He is. Yeah, I mean, he's always a snob. But also, the fact that there's no like scene where like Capote like breaks down. It's like nobody has any idea how like difficult it is to be like a gay man living and like the 1960s.
it's just all...
It's just kind of like it is what it is, and it's not done in a very didactic way. Is what I really like about it. So, for example, there's also that great scene, which is presented without commentary, where he's on the phone in the booth and he's talking to Jack. And he looks across the street, and there's a guy looking at him.
I wanted to talk about the scene.
Yeah.
Tell me more. What happens?
So he's talking to Jack. He's looking across the street. He's in Kansas, I believe.
Yeah.
And there's a man basically staring at him.
Yes.
And initially, it's framed and it's presented in this very ominous, sinister way.
Like that guy's going to beat the shit out of him.
Exactly.
And that guy looks like a cop.
Right. He looks like a cop. And then he hangs up on Jack. And you cut to like a much larger shot, and you see that this guy's standing in front of a bar.
We call that a wide shot, George.
A wide shot. And I forgot I'm talking to somebody who's in the biz.
In the biz.
Yeah, and then there's things on the screen that you see.
They're called stuff.
It's called stuff.
It's called property.
Yeah.
Production design. Anyway, sorry.
And you notice that this guy's actually standing in front of a bar, and he walks into the bar.
Yeah.
And then Capote
Follows
hangs up
him into the
and
bar.
follows him into the bar. And the way obviously it's framed is that this is a gay bar.
Yes.
And then that's like
I want to
it's
take
a scene
you
of
to
cruising.
a gay bar.
Yeah.
A gay bar.
It's a Ween, right?
No, that's Electric Six.
Oh, okay.
Get with the fucking program.
Sorry.
Yeah, but I actually wrote down because that was my reaction to that scene. But I was like, wait, what's going on? What's going on in this scene?
Yeah.
But that's obviously what it was.
And I love that because again, it's presented without commentary. It's not done in any sort of like really didactic sort of way.
Do you feel like this film has something to say a little bit about like our contemporary moment? Because I feel like it does in terms of the way it relates this kind of like very this sort of flamboyant gay man dropped into like what you would commonly call red state America. And like there's a scene when he's buying the baby food, and there's this little boy who's like he's like dressed like a cowboy who like has a gun and like looks at him funny and like pretends to shoot him, and like Capote it's one of the most unnerving scenes in the movie, because as you said, the movie deals with the fact that he's in this place in a way that like challenges you to. It never says like, oh, I'm a gay man, I'm gonna get killed in this place, but the threat feels like it's always there.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't feel like the threat is always there,
but
because there's no scene where like a cop, for example, like harasses him.
But you feel that he feels out of place there and maybe scared of being in a place like that.
Well, he doesn't, because he also like walks up to people and like walks into the police like station as if like he fucking owns the place.
Yeah, but I think that's a survival thing. I think that's what's effective about that, is that he knows he has to kind of operate in a certain way, and also he's entitled and snobby and thinks he can do what he wants. But
So if he's entitled though, does he really feel threatened? That scene, but yes, you're right about that one scene where where there is that kind of sense of
yeah,
and there are those moments. I'm not saying there aren't those moments where he feels as if he's like
Uneasy.
other
Yeah.
and different from what he's surrounded by.
Well, that's a big theme of the movie, I would say, as well.
But I think the way I read a lot of those scenes was just that he's supremely confident in his abilities and in his charm and in his wit.
Yeah.
And the way he's able to like bring things out of people.
I agree with you. But don't you feel like some of that comes from living a life where you're constantly like you have to learn to transcend kind of that thing when you are, because he talks about being different in the course of the whole film.
Right.
So it's like it speaks to a little bit like a survival mechanism. And also we understand him to be a survivor because he was constantly as a child put into new environments with his mother who would lock him in a closet or in a hotel room and like go out.
Yeah, yeah.
So he's learned how to like occupy space in a very specific way. But there's always, it's a beautiful part of the performance. There's always, to me, that little bit of like, just that hair of unease in terms of how he relates to the world.
No, that I would say without question that there is, again, like at times this tension. I just didn't feel like that goes back to also, I think, the way like the film doesn't like go over the top with its like criticism of like the Midwest or like flyover countries.
And Chris Cooper is a big part of why it works. It's a great performance.
Yeah, totally. But that it's again this kind of there's this tension, there's this dichotomy, but I think that the film presents it in like a very nuanced way.
Yes. Let's talk a little bit about Phil, because I actually felt like I was talking to a coworker recently, and she was like, it's interesting that she understood it. He is, as an actor or as a person, seemed to be sort of coded straight. Mm-hmm. But so many of the parts he played in films had this. He plays a queer or a gay character. Mm-hmm. Boogie Nights, this film obviously, and Flawless.
Yes, yeah.
And it was interesting because he was an executive producer on this film. So that's interesting. And a lot of what I'm doing is conjecture here, but I really feel as though when he talks about feeling different and an other and all these things, it's truthful to him as like the conviction of, he's an amazing actor, so that's fine. But there's so much conviction to what he's doing in this film that it felt, I don't know, this was one of the first films where I thought a little bit about like who Phil Hoffman was in relationship to a character that he was playing. And it feels like, as a producer on a film like this, you helped to get it made. So I don't know if I just think it's very, very interesting that he would, or that there's an autobiographical quality to the film in some way. And I'm not sure what that is, except to say that maybe the outsider quality is something that spoke to him.
Yeah. Not to be dismissive though, but isn't there, or like reductive, but isn't there an argument that like... Do
I need to tweet at you again about your dismissiveness?
That any sort of, let's say, especially... with any sort of kind of art, right? That one is to some degree doing something autobiographical.
Yeah.
But there's always this kind of like low-level autobiographical element to it.
Well, I'd hate to say it, George, but you're being dismissive right now.
Well, you know me. George Dismissive Fergopoulos.
Is dismissive a Greek name?
Yeah. Ne, which means yes in Greek.
Really?
Ne. Mm-hmm.
That's got to get confusing.
Why?
Because in English it's yes and no, and it's fine. Sure, there's certainly an autobiographical quality to it, but
I get what you're saying. That there's
we've been watching. Go ahead.
No, that he could draw potentially from something. The same sense of, because again, he might not. I don't know, like look like a conventional leading man. Right. That he can draw from that experience. I don't know.
Okay, so that's something that's really that's a good thing to pull from, is that he is at this point in his career a storied actor who is not like Tom Cruise, though he's played opposite him on numerous occasions, but he keeps getting these parts and he keeps, being a big movie star. And I think it's just interesting that, maybe it is the non-conventional thing. Maybe it's growing up with a single mother as a parent, which is something he thanks his mother for in his speech at the Oscars.
Yeah.
Again, we're not here to psychologize and look at the outside kind of life of the person playing the part, but I think I was sort of just like really curious as to why he wanted to do this film, and maybe it's the strength of the character, or maybe it's the character, or all these things, but I was just very like impressed by how personal it feels, because the performance is so strong. And again, I think it's bullshit to say like, oh god, this must have been so personal for him, but I don't know, there's something I really spent a lot of the time being like, wow, because there's and I mean this in the most positive way, there's a very workman-like quality to his performances. They're always technically and perfectly refined and powerful, and there's so much, and they're always emotional, but the emotion in this part is so restrained and so powerful.
Well, that goes back to what I was also saying about like the craftsmanship of the movie in general,
Right.
Which it's fine. Also, I like to say like there's a technical kind of mastery at display here,
Right?
That doesn't necessarily mean there's anything like wrong with it.
And the guy who directs his like I think it's his first fiction film.
Huh? You said he was doing documentaries before?
Yeah, he did a documentary before, and he did a bunch of commercials. I want to look that up real quick. But it is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful movie.
You said, the other thing also that you said too that. I mean, obviously,
that you're going to object to, George.
We haven't read it, so we can't comment on it. But that this is also based on a book about the writing of In Cold Blood. To just think about that in relation to what you're saying, about
Tell me, what do you mean?
Well, just you were like, what is it that drew him to this project? It may not have even been like, oh, I was a huge Capote head growing up, or I loved In Cold Blood, but like, no, I read this book, and it like really made me think about this author and this man and this person who wrote this book. And about how this story is fascinating. Not even just the story of the murders themselves, but the story of the writing of the murders.
And it is a really fascinating story. And, it speaks to kind of the challenge in life of creating an autobiographical or a film that deals with nonfiction and the way it challenges people, because he's writing about a real situation occurring as it is occurring, and sort of the inherent complexity of that and how it tore that guy apart. And it's fun. Let's say the last 30 minutes of the movie, he never doesn't have a drink in his hand, except for in the scene when he goes to visit these guys. But otherwise, he's on the plane drinking, he's at home drinking. There's always a bottle of JB. Oof. There's also gin. It's just
not a big JB fan.
No, it's just the movie does a really good job of making you feel like you're watching an alcoholic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what at the beginning feels kind of romantic and fun, by the end it's just like
no, totally.
So,
and there's again that kind of tension that he has with Harper Lee, and kind of what you assume is kind of the end or the ending of their
friendship. I don't know how it ended, though. I do know that she went on to be such a success, because part of the film is her finding out that Mockingbird is going to get published.
I was fucked up.
Yeah, you messed that up really hard.
But that there's also an interesting parallel too, because to some degree their greatest successes are their greatest failures, because Harper Lee famously obviously didn't publish anything else in her lifetime, or she did publish that last book. Oh no, wait, I think that was still posthumously, right?
The one that came out a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I think that was either done
by the family may have put together that. It was To Kill a Mockingbird the last thing she published.
Yeah. Silence.
I don't think I knew that. I think I'd forgotten.
It again made her obviously super famous, but then she famously became like a recluse.
I think it's worth before wrapping up talking a little bit about how the film deals with the sort of way that creativity can be destructive without ever overstating. You're such a dick.
No, you're right.
without ever stating it. Like, it shows the physical manifestation of how like a creative energy can be misused or let's say misappropriated in terms of he's pursuing a truth, but he does it through lies and through manipulation, and that ultimately results in, I think, his downfall as a writer and as a human being, because by the end of the film he's still sympathetic because you feel for him, but
the way it ends is like it suggests again what you were saying, that there's in the act of making this masterpiece he kind of destroys himself.
And the film deals with all that without overstating it. And I think this is an interesting thing, that the final text in the film says, the final thing we read on screen says he died in 1984 from complications due to alcoholism.
Right.
And if you actually look it up, it is a liver cancer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And again, an interesting thing to think about when you think about Phil Hoffman as a guy who struggled with alcohol and drugs for a large part of his life.
Yeah.
But I love this film.
What a downer. I really enjoyed this film too. I'd never seen it before. I'm glad I saw it.
I saw it in the theater when it came out. I saw it in 2006. It was actually the first movie I saw when I moved to the Czech Republic. It was the first movie I went. They have assigned seating there.
Whoa.
I was like, what the fuck? Assigned seating? And now I could never live without it. I could never live without it. I need assigned seating.
Then you what you're doing.
I need it. George, I need it.
Do you need it? I need it right now.
Anything else we want to say about Capote?
No, you should definitely see it.
Yeah, it's
if
wonderful.
If you haven't seen it, check it out.
And
read In Cold Blood.
I should. Should I read In Cold Blood and then give you a book report?
Yes, please. 5,000 words.
Did you call me a pleb?
Yeah, of course.
Why?
Because you haven't read In Cold Blood.
Oh, because I haven't read In Cold Blood. Have you read To Kill a Mockingbird?
I have.
Oh. Did you see the play?
It's been a very long time. I've not seen the play.
Yeah, I haven't either. I don't think I'm
Oh my God, isn't that like Sorkin?
Yeah, but it's supposed to be very good.
Yeah, but I fucking hate that guy.
Really?
Yeah.
Why? Because he's terrible.
The West Wing, yeah. West Wing,
Oh,
sorry.
I like the West.
And also-
I like the first season of the West Wing.
And then also like recently he was like complaining about like millennials. Like, God,
yeah. Ugh, millennials.
it's like fucking. I hate-
Just get a show on Broadway, you guys.
Yeah.
Everything will be fine.
yeah. Get an HBO show.
Come on, guys.
Write a movie about the American president falling in love, and that's it. You're good.
You're good.
Yeah.
And we're good.
We are.
And
Liam.
I'm Liam Billingham.
I'm George Fragopoulos.
And
I was about
this-
to say one thing that's not good as a current state of this country, but other
It's
than
a
that,
nightmare.
we're good.
Other than that, it's
We're
great.
good. I'm George Fragopoulos.
I'm Liam Billingham, and this was
Peace. Overbusters.
Peace.
Peace.
Bye.
Peace.